I really am having an odd technology hates me day today. I'm not a huge fan of it. All right. And of course, just to top it off, my tablet decided to pull up last week's sermon instead of this week's sermon. I really am batting 1,000. Oh, man. All right, here we are. Whew, okay, deep breath in. Focus. All right, I think we're good now. We'll see what happens when something else breaks, but for now, I think we're good. So, how about Jesus' weird parable today, huh? So this is one that always doesn't seem right. I mean, Jesus tends to be a kind of guy that talks about things like being honest and trustworthy and things that the guy in this parable isn't. I mean, well, we'll get there in a minute. So the scene starts off in chapter 15 where Jesus is with a crowd of tax collectors and sinners. And some Pharisees and teachers of the law show up in front of him and basically start talking bad about him, saying, "This man eats with tax collectors and sinners." Because, as far as they're concerned, that makes you a horrible and awful person, and no good shall ever come of you. Really helpful attitude those tax collectors or those Pharisees and teachers of the law seem to have. And so Jesus starts out by telling a whole bunch of parables at this point. He starts out with, what we kind of know now as the parables of the lost stuff. He tells the parable of the lost coin about a woman who loses a coin in her house and tears the house up and down to try to find it. He tells the story of the lost sheep, about the guy who loses a sheep and leaves the whole flock behind and goes and finds it. And then he tells the story about the lost son, about the guy whose son wants all his money and he goes off and loses all the money and ends up feeding pigs and goes home and ends up welcomed home, and then the other son gets mad. I think that's a pretty good summary of the parables of the lost stuff, but I'm partial to my own summary. So then we get to this thing, the parable of the shrewd manager, or as it probably ought to be called, the parable of the crook. So there's a rich guy, and he has someone, we'll call him his accountant. So he has an accountant. And the accountant apparently has been skimming off of the top of the rich guy's property. And so the rich guy says to the accountant, "Tell me where my money I had a good sleep last night too. This is not okay." So the guy says to the accountant, "Where's my money? Where is it all gone? And by the way, I'm probably going to fire you for this." Now, the accountant, knowing that he stole his master's money, thinks to himself and says, "Well, let's see. I'm not going to be an accountant for very much longer. And I'm kind of a weakling, so probably a day laborer is not a good job for me. And I'm too proud to be a beggar, so that's right out." And it always did kind of bother me that it says something about how good of a job he did for his current manager or his current boss because he's not looking for another accountant gig. I mean, normally you get fired from one job, you just find another one in a similar career. This guy's like, "Well, I'm either going to be a beggar or a laborer." He must have done a really awful job. So, this fellow finally has a bright idea, and he says, "I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to make some new friends. How can I make new friends? How can I make new friends? Oh, I'm good at cooking books. That's what I'll do." And that is exactly what he does. He goes out to all the folk that owes his soon-to-be former employer money and says, "Hey, how much do you owe him?" "Oh, I owe 800 gallons of olive oil." No, you don't. You owe 400. Congratulations. Where'd that other 400 go? There was never any other 400. These aren't the 400 barrels of oil you're looking for. The guy who owed 1,000 bushels of wheat, it's 800 now. Where'd the other 200 go? Doesn't matter. Now, here's what's interesting to me about this. In trying to figure out this parable, I read a whole bunch of different commentaries, and those are only so helpful. And the commentaries on this one are, well, let's just say they're really a stretch. They quote these obscure Jewish lending traditions that you can't loan somebody with interest, so instead you charge double, and the guy was just making it honest in the first place. No. The guy's a crook. He was incredibly dishonest, and he just stole 400 gallons of olive oil and 200 bushels of wheat from his employer, plus whatever else he might have stolen in the course of his employ. And then something really weird happens, and I'm never quite sure what to do with this, because the guy who was about to fire him says, "Hey, that was clever." I don't understand why that was clever. If I was the guy that just got all this stuff stolen from me, I wouldn't tell him, "Well, that was very clever the way that you just took my livelihood away from me." It's not really like, if somebody picks your pocket, you go, "Oh, that was a very deft sleight of hand trick you did there." So it doesn't always make sense. But then Jesus makes his actual point. Dishonest folk are better at dealing with their money than you are. That's his point. And it takes a minute to think about that. But look at how well the folk who broke Wall Street are doing for themselves. They're doing quite well. It's everyone else that's not. And that's really the point that Jesus is making here. Kind of. You see, you have to remember that it's not about the dishonesty, it's about building community. The guy used some pretty sketchy tactics, but what he did was he built himself a little community so that he had support when he was in trouble. Now, I still think Jesus, and I almost feel bad saying this, I think Jesus could have said this a little better. Apparently, it must have made sense to Jews in the first century. But what it seems like Jesus is telling us to do is to use what we have to build community. And I think this is really one of those confusing parables that if I didn't admit to skipping ones I don't understand all the way a couple of weeks ago, I probably would have skipped. That and the other fact that all the three of our other texts talk about pretty much the same thing. There's a thing that dishonest people are good at, and it's not taking care of the poor. And what's something that Christians are supposed to do? Take care of the poor, right? We're supposed to use what we have to support those who don't have things. I just jumped way off the rails here. I am having trouble today. Maybe I shouldn't go to sleep early. Maybe that's the problem. So we have this manager. He used money, the things at his disposal, to build a community to support himself in his time of need. And as Christians, what we're to do is to use the things that God has blessed us with to build community and support those around us. Because it's the same thing that was said in the prophet Amos. Don't trample the poor and needy, raising prices and reducing the amount sold. It's something similar to what is said in our psalm, to look out for those that aren't being taken care of. And this is where Jesus really drives his point home in verse 13, where he says, "No servant can serve two masters. Either he will hate one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." And that's what makes this parable be about not having wealth, but what you do about it. You see, for a whole bunch of Luke's gospel, if you remember, well, it's not very friendly to people with money. Remember that whole bit of, woe to you who are rich, for you will be made poor. Woe to you who are laughing, for you will mourn. Woe to you who are hungry or who are full, for you will be hungry. It's not very friendly to rich people. But this kind of makes it a little softer because it says it's not about what you have, it's what you do with it. Are you building up relationships or are you destroying them? Are you loving your neighbor in the parable of the Good Samaritan sense? It's the same reason why Jesus says, if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? Because in another place, he also says, put your treasure in heaven. And if we can't be trusted to do good with a little bit of money, can we be trusted to do good with God's gifts? And so what this parable is really saying, and I told you very poorly, so on the internet there's a thing called Too Long Didn't Read. Here's the Too Long Didn't Read summary of this sermon. It's about serving God through what we have, building community among ourselves and others instead of just building up wealth. It's about taking those things that we have been blessed with and blessing others. And most of all, it's about love. The same love that Jesus shows us so that we can be more shrewd in dealing with money than we tend to be. Not shrewdness in the worldly sense, which leads to theft, according to our parable, but shrewdness in the sense of building those friends, building community, building relationships, and furthering God's kingdom in this world.